Well, in the summer of 2013, Sharon and I traveled to Wilmington, North Carolina, to interview to become the organizing pastor of what is now the Bridge Presbyterian Church. Before leaving town, I wanted to show Sharon Wrightsville Beach. So after spending some time touring around the town of Wrightsville Beach, and after spending some time walking the sandy coastline along Wrightsville Beach, we turned west and we headed back home to Spartanburg, South Carolina. Well, being that it was my third trip to Wilmington, North Carolina, I knew my way around town pretty well. Yeah. So I decided I would be navigator and driver. From Wrightsville Beach, all we needed to do was get on US 74 West, and we'd be good to go. Somehow, I got turned around, and I ended up on Market Street, of all places. It's a little crazy for me. Having gotten turned around and completely disoriented, I remember as we were driving down Market Street, my wife Sharon, she turned to me and she said, "Are you sure that this is the way home?" Of course, I was a little agitated with Sharon for even asking such a question. And I said to her, "Sweetheart, this is my third trip to Wilmington. I'm sure I know the way home." A little while later, she said, "You know, Doug, this street that we are driving down right now, this doesn't look anything like the highway we drove into Wrightsville Beach on." And now I was very agitated, and I said, "Sharon, I got this. Don't worry." But I was lost. Yes, I was. I was lost. And the longer we stayed on Market Street, the more clearly it became to everyone in that car that the driver was lost. So I decided to do what most men do when they're lost. You know what I did?
Keep driving.
I lied. We were driving, and I looked, and I said, "Look, honey, look, there's a gas station over on the left. I'm going to go in there because I have to go to the bathroom." So I drove into the gas station, and returning to the car, I swallowed my pride, and I admitted that I was lost and that I needed help finding my way back home. Friends, God is calling all of us home to a relationship with Him through Jesus Christ. But the people who are most likely to find their way back home in a relationship with the Lord are those people who are comfortable admitting that they're lost and that they need help finding the way back home. In the parable of finding home, both brothers are lost. Both brothers need help finding the way home. They need to be saved. The younger brother, remember, he left home, he got lost, and he ended up in a pigsty. The older brother, he stayed put. But as we'll see, he never quite felt like he was at home, even though he stayed put. Now, the younger brother got back on the path towards home, while the older brother, he never quite could. And anyone want to guess how the younger brother differed from the older brother? How the younger brother got on the path back home to the Father, while the older one didn't? The reason is because the younger brother acknowledged that he was lost and needed to be saved. And the older brother couldn't do that. This morning, as we continue in the parable of finding home, I want to ask you again to think about the question that we're going to continue to think about throughout this series. The question is, which of the two siblings do you most easily identify with? Which of their stories is your story? This morning we're going to look a little bit more closely again at the younger son. This morning we pick up the parable of finding home in verse 14, and if you want to look with me on your handouts, on your bulletins, you're welcome to do that. We're going to start reading at verse 14 today, where we find the younger son is literally going through hell. Listen as I read, beginning at verse 14. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Now the younger son was about as low as a human being can get. He was alone. He was broke. He was homeless, and he was starving. And you see, for a young Jewish fella, eating and living with pigs was about as humiliating as you could possibly get. Chances are that none of us in this room have ever sunk that low and have ever gotten that far down in life. But that doesn't mean we haven't at some point slipped into a pigsty or two of our own. You see, the pigsty in this parable is really a metaphor. It's a metaphor for living in despair. And so the question I ask you this morning is, are you living in despair? Are you close to despair? Are you close to sliding into a pigsty of your own? Before you say no, consider some of the pigsties that are common for Christians who live in the suburbs of America today. Some of us are living in a pigsty of anxiety. We tell our friends we're living the dream, but in reality we are chronically anxious about everything. We feel trapped in this unrelenting sense of uncertainty, afraid of our future, afraid of our past, afraid of misfortune, afraid of everything. And we have this habit, decades old, of always going to the worst case scenario in life and seeing the world from the worst case scenario. In the pigsty of anxiety, we wallow in fear, apprehension, and chronic negativity. Are any of you living in a pigsty of anxiety? Others of us here this morning are living in a pigsty of dissatisfaction. We came here to Brunswick County hoping to find a little slice of heaven on earth, and by and large it's been pretty good, right? Beaches are great, neighborhoods are great, weather's wonderful, taxes are lower than wherever we came from, right? Things are good, but there's still within us this emptiness, right? The sense that we still haven't found what we're looking for. In the pigsty of dissatisfaction, we wallow in the slop of restless boredom. We're addicted to the yearning for what's next. Are you in the pigsty of dissatisfaction? A little empty, never quite satisfied? Some of us are living in the pigsty of self-destruction. Well, from outside, life appears to be blessed, even charmed. But inside, some of us are slaves to a secret inner demon. Maybe a compulsive, self-destructive habit. We find ourselves trapped in this pattern of poor decision-making and then deception to cover the poor decisions we make. And pretty soon, life is one big deception. And in the pigsty of self-destruction, we wallow in the slop of shame, and we wallow in the slop of guilt and deception, all never quite able to accept ourselves and wondering how in the world God could love us. Are you in the pigsty of self-destruction? Still others of us live in the pigsty of the past. We moved here in search of a fresh start, a new beginning. But we haven't been able to leave the past behind, and so we are dominated by a past situation, a past mistake, or we're dominated by somebody in our past who is so dictating our present that we're miserable. In the pigsty of the past, we wallow in the slop of regret, bitterness. You know, it's ironic that so many of us came here to Brunswick County, North Carolina, in search of a new home and a fresh start. But we choose to wallow in our self-imposed pigsty instead. Lost, unable to find the home, the very place that we chose to call home. You know, you're in a pigsty if you feel hopeless, because the hallmark of a pigsty is despair. Are you in a pigsty now? Do you want to know the way out? Do you want to find the thing that you came here in search of, which is home, but home with God? There's a way. There's hope. The younger brother was lost in a pigsty of his own creation, right? But that pigsty was not all bad. Because the pigsty that the younger brother found himself in, he hit bottom. And when you hit bottom and you muster the courage to acknowledge you're in a pigsty, there are only 4 things you can do. Number 1, you can blame other things for landing you in the pigsty. You know, the younger son could have said, you know, if I just wouldn't hurt my knee while dancing on the tabletop that time, then I wouldn't have had to have surgery. I wouldn't have got addicted to painkillers. I wouldn't be in this mess. You can blame things for landing you in the pigsty, but that's not the way out. That's the way of denial. Secondly, you can blame yourself for landing in the pigsty. The younger son could have said, you know, I am a total screw-up. Every time I'm given some responsibility, I mess it up. I'm a failure in life. But blaming yourself for landing in the pigsty is not the way out either. That's the way of self-destruction. Well, third, you can blame the world for landing you in the pigsty. The younger son could have said, you know, Dad should have known better than giving me this money because he knows that I wouldn't spend it all. And I should have never gotten involved with that diva because she went through all my money. Blaming the world for being in a pigsty is not the way out either. It's only the way of victimization. So you can blame the world. You can blame yourself. You can blame things, or you can confess you're lost and you need to be saved. And that, friends, is the way out of a pigsty. And that's the beginning of a way home in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's what the younger son did. In verse 17 and following, we see that the younger son finally, the arc of his life began to bend homeward, even though he had to fall into a pigsty to get there. Verse 17 says, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up and I'll go to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, so treat me like one of your hired hands. The younger son made a life life-changing decision that got him out of the pigsty and on the path back home with God. The decision was to admit that he was lost. Verse 17 reads, "But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, and I'm dying of hunger?'" The phrase "came to himself" is coded language for being totally honest with yourself. Having a ruthless moral inventory and quit blaming things and quit being a victim and quit being and blaming the world and simply saying honestly and acknowledging to God, "I am lost and I need to be saved." You know, when I got lost on the way home from Wrightsville Beach, the really hard part wasn't telling Sharon that I was lost. The really hard part was admitting it to myself. Finding home. The very thing that so many of us came to Brunswick County in search of is not easy. Finding our way home to God is hard. Not only because you have to confess your sin to God, but because you have to confess to yourself that you're lost. And that's what so many people miss about a relationship with Jesus Christ. Every Sunday morning during our worship service, we confess our sin to God, right? But I'm not sure that we all get that confess your sin to God thing. When we confess our sin, we must never forget that the essence of sin is not angering God or being displeasing to God. If that were the essence of sin, then all we'd have to do is say, "Well, I'm sorry for doing what was wrong, God." The essence of sin is separation from God. It is our willingness to leave home. And when we do that, we get lost. So confession is so much more than just saying, "Oh, Lord, I'm sorry that I did what's wrong." Confession is going to God and honestly saying, "I'm lost. I have left home, and I admit it. And Lord, I need help. Turn me around and get me home." That's what the younger son did. But the first step, of course, is honestly admitting that we need God's help in our life, that we're lost. What about us here this morning? We call Brunswick County our home, yet some of us remain far from home, don't we? Like the younger sibling, we still wallow in our self-imposed pigsties. Anxiety, pigsty of self-destruction, the pigsty of the past, whatever pigsty. You know it better than I do. Maybe you need to follow the path of the younger sibling. Admit you're lost. Confess to God you need to be saved. And let God steer you back home on the path back to a relationship with Jesus Christ. But unless I miss my guess, many of us here don't feel very lost at all. In fact, all we do is feel busy, right? Busy, busy, busy. With all the urgent stuff of life. We're busy keeping our house clean, and we're busy paying our bills, and we're busy buying groceries, and we're busy going to our therapist, and we're busy checking out new neighbors, and busy checking out new restaurants. Busy, busy, busy. If that's you, then here's my challenge. Take it or leave it. Try slowing down. Try slowing down. Maybe listening to your life and seeing if staying busy is your way of pretending that that ache in your stomach for something more is really not there. Perhaps that ache for something more is the reason you came here. And that ache in your stomach for something more, that emptiness, is what keeps you busy. But the only thing that can fill that emptiness It's coming home with the Lord. If you identify more with the younger brother, either because you are always looking for what's next, always have this emptiness, or because you're in a pigsty right now, if you identify more with the younger brother, it's because you realize you're not at home. The people reading Isaiah's words were Hebrew people who were far from home, deported, living on the banks of Babylon. But they realized at one point they were lost, and they acknowledged they needed God to save them. So the words of Isaiah, which we read earlier, they were words of great comfort and great hope for the Hebrew people, because they were in a pigsty. As we close, I want you to listen again to these words. And if you're lost, if you're living in a pigsty, or if you're continually searching to fill that emptiness in your stomach, claim these words for yourself. Do not fear, for I am with you. Don't be afraid, for I'm your God. I'm going to strengthen you. I'm going to help you. I'll uphold you with my victorious right hand. That's the Lord calling us home, out of the pigsty, out of our emptiness, into a new and freed relationship with Jesus Christ. Let's pray.